Okay, aloha everyone and good evening. Thank you for joining us for this seminar on new features for Transpac 2025. I'm Alan Andrews. I'm the Vice Commodore and Race Committee Chair for Trans-Pacific Yacht Club. We're honored to have with us here tonight renowned navigator Stan Honey, who is also a longtime member of Transpac's technical committee and very involved with offshore sailing, both through U.S. sailing and world sailing. As Randy noted, he is helping out. Randy's a director and is our seminars chair. He's helping out with the questions in the chat. And Allie Bell, who is also here as our Rear Commodore and as our communications chair. What we're going to do tonight is we have, I think I'd like to share my screen. Well, we're gonna cover four basic topics here. One is scoring, the forecast TCF scoring that Transpac's using this year. We're going to be also covering AIS, where World Sailing is requiring racers to have AIS in this situation. And we're going to cover the availability of paid weather and other information, and also talk about the tracker for Transpac and the timing on the tracker. I don't use my, hoping to share my screen here, and I haven't used Zoom in a while on that part of it. So
it's at the bottom. It's a green button on the
one that
bottom.
says share.
Yeah. The green up arrow.
Okay. And
There we go. Good.
okay. So one of the things that's new this year for Transpac is the forecast TCF scoring. And it should do a better job of scoring than what's happened in the past. It won't be perfect, but it is something that should be an improvement. And Stan was one of the leaders in looking at and promoting this type of scoring, and then also showing the rest of us that it's pretty complicated, but it's actually possible to do with everything that's out there. And so perhaps at this stage, I can let Stan take us through the basics on FTCF scoring, and I can help out with adding a couple little things in here or there as well.
Okay, that sounds fine. So can we leave your screens up and I'll just talk to it? Does that
Sure
work?
thing.
Okay. So the early days of Transpac, and I guess my Transpac dates back to the, early 70s and later. The Transpac was scored with a single number rule, IOR, but because Transpac is a predominantly off-wind race, the IOR had to be corrected. And so that's when I first joined the Transpac technical committee, working with George Griffith. And the IOR had corrections built in, BDR and SHR, which is base displacement ratio and sail hull ratio. But there was basically all these fixes that got applied to the IOR to deal with the fact that there was a predominantly downwind race. And that looked like it was destined to result in a quagmire of patches. And so then it was a far better approach to take advantage of the VPP-based rules, because the VPP-based rules, by their nature, they generate a set of polars, which estimate the performance of every boat on all wind speeds and wind angles. And so therefore you could have a wind matrix and use those polars and then use those to come up with the handicap system for the Transpac. And so that started with IMS, AmeriCap, ORR, et cetera. And we've been doing that for 30 plus years. And then the Transpac wind matrix, originally when that got developed, and I think that was in the late 80s, but when that originally got developed, there was a number of navigators, and I was one of them, that were asked to come up with that wind matrix. And that included Mark Rudiger, myself, John Jourdain, Ben Mitchell Sr. But basically, we all scratched our heads, came up with a wind matrix. And then over the years, it's been improved and refined as we've gotten access to grid files and historical weather data. But it was actually kind of astonishing to me that we came pretty darn close all those years ago, just dredging data out of our logbooks. But nevertheless, the wind matrix made this assumption that every single Transpac is exactly the same and every start day for every Transpac is exactly the same. The FTCF system, it similarly uses a VPP-based rule, ORR to be specifically, but it scores data with, instead of using a wind mix, it scores data with the winds from a forecast that are available the morning of each start. And then a boat is routed, and then a TCF for each boat is calculated before the start. And then so the sailors still get a single number for every boat. So it's easy to calculate standings. It's easy to calculate who you owe time to, who owes you time. It's easy to figure out who you need to cover, whether you need to split. You know, so the racing stays the same. It's just the single number TCF that we're used to racing under. That single number TCF is calculated in a far more sophisticated way that actually takes the forecast for that particular race. And it also takes into account the performance characteristics of a given boat. So if you have a high performance boat, it knows the fact that that boat can go hunting for more wind to the south because it has hotter jibe angles. And if you have a slower, sluggier boat, it knows that that boat is basically limited to sail a much straighter course because of its deeper angles. So it even takes that into account. The forecast, of course, isn't perfect, but it's far better than the Transpac wind matrix. And the Transpac wind matrix was actually pretty good, but the error with the wind matrix is it assumed the exact same wind every year and for every start of every year. And so the system of using a forecast, even though the forecasts aren't perfect, is far better than that assumption. Next slide. So one question that comes up a lot is, does the FTCF system impact your strategy? And the answer is no, it does not. The objective of every boat is still to finish as soon as possible. And it doesn't matter, you know, what the route was that was used to compute your TCF or what wind forecasts were used to compute your TCF. You got a TCF, it got issued the morning of the start, and the sooner you finish, the better you're going to do. So your goal, as with all previous years, is to use the best forecasts you can, the best routing algorithms you can, the best hunches you can, and get to the finish as soon as you can. And that's how, you know, so that part of the Transpac, of course, hasn't been changed. But we do believe that the FTCF scoring will make it a better race. Analysis from rescoring previous Transpacs, and I worked extensively on this with Alan and with Jim Teeters. And we rescored, you know, various Transpacs, and we rescored, you know, also worked with the CCA and the Bermuda race and rescored a number of Bermuda races and other races around the world. And ORC is using a very similar technology that's called, they call it WRS for weather routing scoring, but it's essentially the same. But there's been a ton of analysis done by ORC and CCA, Jim Teeters, myself, rescoring previous races. And it shows that FTCF, one of the advantages, more of the fleet will stay in the hunt for more of the race. So the thing that can go wrong with a Transpac, as we all know, is that we start on different days. And the weather at the beginning of the Transpac tends to go in this sort of weekly cycle of more breeze and less breeze. And so there tends to be a lucky start day and then a couple of unlucky start days. And the use of FTCF, the forecast will accurately predict that. And so they'll somewhat reduce the factor of the lucky and unlucky start days. Let's go back to that previous slide for just a little longer, Alan. It also reduces the horses for courses impact. So that, you know, if you have a heavy boat or if you have a light boat, the heavy boats will do better in races that are, you know, windy, planing races than they otherwise would have, and then vice versa. So the FTCF will keep more boats in the hunt for more of the race, but our analysis has shown it really doesn't change the ordering of the top finishing boats. What it does do is it lets the rest of the fleet have a lot more fun with their race. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. This is a plot. This was part of a research paper that Jim Teeters and I wrote and submitted for the Chesapeake Sailing Yacht Symposium. And in that research paper, we analyzed the previous scoring of the last Transpac, the 23 Transpac. And it's worth taking a minute to understand this graphic. The Transpac 23, as it was scored, are the blue lines. The group to the left, that's the high performance boats that started last. The group in the middle, they got the lucky day. And then the group on the right was the slower boats. And then you can see the blue lines are the plot of the corrected time delta off of the winner for those three fleets. And so you can see Westerly won. You can see that the high performance boats were out of the hunt because they got the unlucky start day. And you can see the slow boats, they did okay, but they were still out of the hunt. And then if you rescore the race using FTCF, it's interesting that it doesn't change the leaders, meaning the lucky start day still did the best, but it brings the high performance boats into the hunt. That orange curve is further down, so it's essentially at the same height as the three other orange curves. And then the FTCF system didn't make a big difference to the middle starter and to the first starter, the ones on the far right, but it definitely bunched up the results. So the boats that sailed the best still won, of course, but the rest of the fleet that also sailed well, but had the bad luck to start on a bad day, they stayed in the hunt for more of the race, and presumably that would allow them to enjoy the racing more.
So Stan, another way to look at this is that FTCF didn't change the class results very much, but it changed the overall fleet results quite a bit. The guys that had the lucky start day, some of them weren't quite as lucky overall. And the guys that had the bad start day, they were still in the hunt and for overall finishes.
Really good observation that it definitely compressed the fleet results. It didn't change the winners in fleet, but it definitely bunched up the fleet results. And I think would have helped avoid a situation that happens in a number of Transpacs, where you realize you picked the unlucky day, and from the day of your start, that you're out of the hunt for a fleet result. And I think the FTCF will help dramatically reduce that effect for the Transpac, where it's solving the problem of the lucky start day. And then just as an aside, for Bermuda race or something like that, they all start at the same day. The problem with the Bermuda race is you have this high pressure breakwater that just settles across the fleet in mid race. And the FTCF system goes a long way towards addressing that. And similarly, keeping more of the fleet in the hunt for much more of the race, but not actually changing who the actual winners are, but it definitely bunches up the fleet.
One thing I thought I'd also mention with the FTCF is that most people will see on your rating certificate, there's a Transpac rating, and that rating is the old win matrix. And that's used by the race committee to help put boats in different classes, to figure out the start day and that sort of stuff. But that's not the boat's rating. And when you get the rating on the morning of the start, it will be a different number. It'll still have, if your boat rates 1.04, it'll still be 1.04, 1.03, 1.05, somewhere in there. Because we use the same scratch boat, but it will be different. And also, if there are other boats that are similar to you, your rating relative to that other boat might be different too. If you have another boat that you rate pretty close to, your ratings may even switch as to who owes each other time, because the rating that's on your rating certificate is based on that historical win matrix. And if the weather for this race is going to be different, one boat that's a light air boat and the other boat's a heavy air boat, their ratings may flip-flop because the VPP and the weather forecast know that. So it's something to not be surprised about if there are some flips of the rating one way or the other on that sort of thing.
The other thing that that it makes sense to do, and that we will do, is to disclose the details for those people who care of exactly how the TCFs are calculated. And just to give a quick overview, we use Expedition. We run an ORR polar for every boat. We run the route to Hawaii, starting at the time of each day's start. And we use the GFS for the global model, and we use the HRRR out to a point about due south of Point Conception when the boats get outside the effects of terrain. And then the forecasts that are used are the latest forecasts that are available before the time to give Jim Teeters time to come up with a TCF for every boat that would be distributed, the morning of each start. And then all of the parameters that you use to set up Expedition in terms of the various weights and the resolution and the types of routing and all of that will be summarized and disclosed to the fleet, so that folks, if they're curious, can reconfirm the calculations and see how the TCFs were generated. But again, it doesn't matter how we did it. From the standpoint of racing, you get a TCF, and after the start, your goal isn't to somehow magically sail along the route that was used to calculate the TCF. Your goal is to get to the finish as soon as you can, as before. So the racing is as simple as it ever was. The calculation of the TCF itself is more complicated than it has been in the past.
Yeah. And if people may not understand how the TCF is calculated, it's basically we have a scratch boat that's one of the Rogers 46s, and their rating will be 1. So it's the ratio of the predicted elapsed time for your boat to the predicted elapsed time for the Rogers 46. So if you're sailing a ULDB 70, you're going to be rated faster than the Rogers 46. So your rating is going to be 1.1 or something like that. If you're sailing a Cal 40, your rating is going to be slower. So your rating is going to be 0.7 or something like that. So that's how the rating is. And then the corrected time is your elapsed time times your rating. And then whoever's got the lowest corrected time wins.
So we will address questions on this stuff, type them into the text, and then we'll get to the questions at the end. Do you want to cover more? Is there anything else we have to cover on this, Alan, or should we move to the next topic?
I think that's probably it on for now.
Okay.
And so on AIS, the big thing is that we know that the safety equipment regulations, USSERs, which we use, require all the boats in an offshore type race like this to carry AIS, and as noted here, and navigation lights. The SERs are silent on usage. It's in the past, it was left up to different races to determine if they should require AIS to be on for the whole race, part of the race, none of the race, or whatever. Starting this year, World Sailing wrote World Sailing Rule 56.3, which requires that if the safety regs for a race require you to have AIS, you must have it on, just like you have to have running lights on. So this has been the big reason that this is one of the main reasons that we have AIS and we have it on. And it's really a safety tool. And what Transpac looked at is World Sailing has a lot more resources than we do to study the practice of using AIS. They have a lot of other parts of the world that use AIS frequently and have used it for a long time. And they determined that it was an important thing to do, to have boats use AIS while racing. And so Transpac looked at it and said, those guys have a lot more resources to study this than Transpac does. So we're going to go along with what that rule says. And so Transpac is requiring the AIS to be transmitting throughout the race.
Alan, can I comment a little bit on the history?
You bet.
I had the misfortune to be at World Sailing for much of the last 20 years as a US delegate. I was chair of the Oceanic and Offshore Committee, and so lived through a lot of these transitions. But the OSRs, the offshore safety regulations, and the SERs, the US safety equipment regulations, started to require AIS in about 2010, just a few years after AIS was invented. And they required the systems to be on board, like Alan mentioned. And the objective of requiring the gear to be on the boats was that having the gear on the boats is very helpful if you need to find boats, if you need to coordinate the movement of boats, if there's a safety issue. And it's also very helpful to have the gear on the boats if people are looking for a man overboard, because the folks in the water, for the most part, carry AIS man overboard beacons, which is probably the single greatest technology that's improved safety for all of us, in our lifetimes. The fact that people can find us if we're in the water using AIS. But again, the OSRs and the SERs, as Alan mentioned, they compel carriage, but they don't compel usage. So then over that 15 years from 2010, when the systems were required to be on board, over the 15 years until now, there's been a slow transition of event organizers around the world, where the event organizers have transitioned towards requiring usage. And at this point, my impression from the races that I've done is that every event organizer now requires AIS to be used all the time. And that includes the major races like the Fastnet, the Hobart, the Bermuda Race, Middle Sea, the Aegean 600, Caribbean 600, Cape Town Rio, the Rue de Rhum, the Ocean Race, Transat Jacques Vabre, Vendée Globe, everybody. And I think Transpac isn't the last to require it. I think Pacific Cup is the remaining race that doesn't require it. But Transpac this year is, sort of joining that group and deciding to require it. And I guess I have to mention that, as an old guy, I kind of mourn the passing of the old days. I mean, I really liked the old days when navigators could sneak around for 24 hours and, jive and split, and nobody'd know where you'd gone for 24 hours. And I frankly liked it when it was hard, because, I got good at it as a young age. So I love the fact that, celestial navigation made it harder, and to do a Fastnet in the late 70s and early 80s, it was a huge advantage to know Morse code so you could draw your own weather maps. But nevertheless, times change. And I think this is one of the impacts of our race. And I think the reason all of these event organizers have now required AIS is that they just can't imagine the embarrassment and the damage to our sport if a race boat that's equipped with safety equipment like AIS, runs down a recreational sailboat or a fishing boat or gets run over by a ship. And then it later turns out that that race boat had safety equipment on, but that equipment wasn't being used, for competitive advantage. And that would be as embarrassing as, turning off your running lights. And so that's why the event organizers have all, through the last 15 years, have all transitioned into, everybody now requiring it, as the Transpac is now doing. Things go slowly at World Sailing. But nevertheless, over the last 5 years, a change was debated and ultimately put into the current racing rules. And this was the rule that Alan mentioned, 56.3, that requires the use of AIS. Now, that is a racing rule that can be changed. So in principle, an event organizer can make an amendment to it. But other than Pacific Cup, no event organizer is amending it. All the other event organizers are leaving that rule in place and requiring the use of AIS. And again, I think the logic that the World Sailing and the event organizers have is that while a number of us mourn the old days, times have changed. This gear is on board, and it just seems irresponsible to have boats have the gear on board and to not have that gear be utilized to, for safety purposes and for collision avoidance, et cetera.
And Stan, I can cite three recent examples of where it's been useful in recent races and safety incidents. One was in the recent report from the Chicago Mackinac race of last summer, where there was a man overboard incident, and the boat that lost the person overboard ended up with a spinnaker wrapped in their rudder and not having any steerage. But they were on AIS and they broadcast to the fleet. The fleet heard them and was able to use AIS to quickly come to their vicinity and then use AIS further to pick up the man overboard who had an AIS beacon, like you mentioned. Another is in commercial traffic in the recent Channel Islands 500 race, which was the replacement for the Cabo race this year. There was when it was blowing 20 knots out there was an integrated tug barge that was crossing the fleet, going against the fleet in the middle of the night. And it was able to identify the boats by AIS, contact them by VHF, and negotiate how it was going to avoid the race boats and understand where the race boats were going and what their courses were going to be, because the race boats had AIS. And then another incident was is the last Transpac, where and this is the sort of thing that can happen in our Transpac, where the fast boats start behind the slow boats and sail through them. There was one of the Mod 70s had a delay of a day or so because they had to fix their engine or something, but they were screaming through the fleet about mid-race and were requesting everybody in the fleet to turn on their AIS so that they didn't run them over. And I was on a pretty fast boat. We were probably averaging about 14 or so, and they appeared on the horizon behind us in the middle of the night as a light, and it quickly got brighter. And within 2 hours, they were over the horizon ahead of us. So again, it's a safety thing, and it actually occurs and actually matters in our racing. So it's even though we more in the old days, it's a good thing having AIS. It helps. One of the other things, let's see,
I think we had one more point on that last slide, which is that, and Alan, you can provide more texture on this, but given the fact that AIS is now on all the time on all the boats, it seemed silly to have the YB, the yellow brick tracking data, be delayed. So this year, the yellow brick tracking data is transmitted in real time, once an hour, and then it's every 15 minutes within 50 miles of the start and 200 miles of the finish. But basically, the yellow brick tracking data is essentially current with real time. So life is quite a bit simpler in that respect.
Yes, there's the way to put it is there's no intentional delay. It may take YB a minute or so from when the data is collected to get it up online, but there is no intentional delay like there'd been a 4-hour delay in the past. And Transpac will confirm the time intervals between tracking at the skippers meeting, but the current intent is for the first 50 miles of the course to have it be broadcast every 15 minutes, then every hour during the bulk of the course, and then for the last 200 miles, also every 15 minutes. And that would be both to the public and to the sailors through the small data files that can be downloaded to go with Expedition or Adrena or whatever weather system or tracking system people are using.
And then as a sort of an observation as a navigator, one big advantage that the yellow brick data has is it's time stamped accurately. And the measurements of everybody's location is basically at the same time, synchronous. So every hour, as a navigator, you get the position, within a minute or so, you get a position of all the boats in the race that are taken at the same time. And so that makes yellow brick, very attractive data to use for your own, tactics and analysis. Although it's absolutely legal to use other sources of tracking data. set a course from your own AIS on your own boat, which has the virtue that it's, real time, all the time for boats that are nearby, within 10 miles or so. But you can also use tracking data from marine traffic, predict wind, and other public sources. But from a navigator standpoint, that other data is somewhat more challenging to use because the satellite AIS data tends to have latency of up to an hour, and the timestamps are not dependable. But the AIS tracking data you get from your own AIS of boats that are nearby, that is, of course, updates every 30 seconds and is absolutely real time. But it only covers the boats that you care most about, meaning the boats that you're racing with in your vicinity. But it is worth pointing out that the yellow brick data is very attractive to navigators because it's uniform and it's accurately timestamped. But other sources are also okay if people choose to use them. And when we get to
should be clear that the other sources here, this is okay for Transpac. It may not be okay for all races, but Transpac has made a modification of the rules to allow people to download these other sources as long as it's publicly available. And we'll have the full text of that in a minute here on another slide. But that's a change to the racing rules, and that Transpac is allowing, as are many other races. You want next slide?
Yep, perfect.
So one thing here is you want to make sure your AIS is working, and this is something that because it is a requirement, it's a rule. One thing that Transpac has done is the Transpac inspectors are checking every boat to make sure the AIS is working as part of the inspection for the boat. And you'll want to check your own boat also before the start and make sure it's working. And then on the way to the starting line, read the sailing instructions. The sailing instructions have a requirement of when you need to turn the AIS on at least an hour before the start. And the race committee is going to check and see if they see your boat on marine traffic or a similar system. But the goal there is to help all the owners know that their AIS is working. And if it's not working, you really probably want to get it fixed before you start the race. So, because you are subject to, it is one of the rules. One of the other things to look at is the status lights on your AIS. And a photo is here of an AIS on a boat that where the AIS was not working. And it took the crew knows a lot more about how to read the status lights now than they did a few weeks ago. But that's something to look at and make sure that you've got things working. And I'm sure Stan knows more about the mechanics of AIS than most people.
Many AIS units, the LEDs are useful and they actually have meaning. And there'll be, one LED that's flashing or showing green if the AIS is successfully receiving GPS positions, which means the antenna hasn't come disconnected or somebody hadn't dropped a sailbag on top of it or sitting on it. And then there'll often be another LED that's green if the unit has successfully transmitted a position. And that means that there is an antenna that's reasonably matched, that's connected, and it's sent it. And that the system hasn't been accidentally set to mute mode. But the LEDs in many units, the LEDs will indicate the status of all of that the GPS is working and the antenna is connected and the thing is actually transmitting. And so it's worth understanding what the LEDs mean. And it's worth installing your transponder in a place where you can see them. And then many AIS transponders have the ability to run some supervisory program on a laptop, and you can get in and check the full detail. And that's of course better still. But just knowing how to read the LEDs and making sure that that you solve the problem if the LEDs indicate that there's a sailbag sitting on the antenna or something, that'll get you, most of the way. This is largely, I've already covered this, but Alan mentioned the potential intention of the Transpac for the 15 minutes for the first 50 miles of the last 200. I mentioned that the yellow brick data has the enormous virtue that it contains all the boats. It has little latency. It has uniform update times and format. It's easy for analysis, and the timestamps are accurate. The AIS information that you get directly from nearby boats has the virtue that it's real time and updates every 30 seconds, but it only covers boats within AIS range, which is about 10 or 20 miles, depending. And then the AIS information that you can get from all these other sources, predict wind, marine traffic, Spire, AIS stream, vessel finder, etc. It's all legal. You can even pay for it, in the Transpac, as Alan mentioned. It does vary in time delay, and the timestamps also vary. In some cases, they don't really include an accurate timestamp. And those AIS positions that come via satellite may have a latency of up to an hour, because the satellite AIS receivers, they just barely are able to receive, a Class B AIS. But when they do get one, they have to store and forward. So the satellite has to remember it and then relay it to shore when it gets over shore, and that can take up to an hour for the satellites that are passing between Hawaii and the California.
And Stan, it's my understanding that just because a boat doesn't show up on satellite AIS doesn't mean that it's not transmitting. It may mean that the satellite's not there at the time.
Yeah, it's an interesting question that, people talk about, well, what's the range of AIS, and well, it turns out that the satellites are about 100 miles away, and satellites, they mostly can receive Class B AIS, but not all the time. So as Alan says, it's sketchy. The satellites do a very good job of receiving Class A AIS from ships that are, spread out on the ocean. But the Class B signals are just barely able to get through to the satellites. So the fact that a boat isn't covered by satellite is not evidence that its AIS doesn't work. The fact that that boat doesn't appear on marine traffic when it's in the vicinity of the start or the finish, that's good evidence it doesn't work. And of course, if a boat can't be seen by boats that are nearby within 10 miles, that would be an indication that they've got an AIS problem. But as Alan said, Class B AIS positions on the high seas, you get them most of the time, but it's not a sure thing for satellite reception of Class B.
Next slide. So this is NOR Amendment number 4. We talked about communications restrictions. We talked about what information boats can download. NOR number 3 was issued about a month ago, and it talked about what you could download. Transpac was since brought to our attention by some really smart people that know the fine points of the racing rules and exactly how things have to be worded, that the way that we had worded this was not exactly proper. So this will be replacing what was published a month ago, and it modifies racing rule number 41C. And so this says, and 41C says you cannot have outside acceptance except for help in the form, in this case, of information widely available to and easily obtained within a reasonable period of time by all boats with or without fees, including data from AIS and other transponders that are required by rules, and that is otherwise not specific to any boat. This changes Rule 41C. So this allows a boat to download weather, to have a weather subscription to the public services that are out there. It allows you to download the marine traffic weather that, or position information that we were talking about. And it allows the Yellowbrook stuff was already allowed. But it's also, it does not allow information that is not specific, or that is specific to any boat, which means that it doesn't allow you to download routing. It doesn't allow shoreside routing. So this is the same, this functions the same as what was published around about a month ago. And we will have a series of Q&A that will be published along with this. That should doesn't change this rule at all, but it helps explain why some of this is written this way. One thing that's been brought up before is, well, what's that do about before the start? I thought we download our weather from, Commander's Weather right before the start. Well, you can do that before the preparatory signal. The question would be, does Rule 41C apply before the boat's preparatory signal? No. It's in the preamble to the racing rules of sailing. And, the other questions would be like, can a boat receive help in the form of routing information tailored to its polars without breaking the rule? No, because that's specific to the boat. Can a boat receive help in the form of routing information tailored to its current or expected position without breaking the rule? No, it cannot. So there's a number of things like that. Can a boat receive help in the form of weather information available to the public that is not specific to the boat or its position without breaking the rule? Yes. And that's the sort of thing that allows you to download weather from not only from the government sources, but from with a Predict Wind subscription or a Windy subscription or something like that. I'll bet there'll be more questions afterwards about this, but I just wanted to let you know that this wording was just agreed with some of the other people involved with Transpac today, and will be posted either tonight, tomorrow, or the next day, depending upon how quickly we can get it online. And with that, we'll move on to the next.
So one way to think about what Alan just said was, obviously before the prep, you can do anything. You can hire, a genius to tell you where to go and get custom weather and all that. But after the prep, during the race, you can download weather data as long as anybody else could get the same data, but you can't get advice. You can't hire somebody like me to tell you where to go if I'm on shore, or you can't hire a service to tell you where to go, from shore. So basically, you have to do your routing from on board the boat. You can download the GRIM files to use it, but you gotta figure out, make your own decisions on where you're going to go. And in part, I think this rule reflects sort of the spirit of Transpac of trying to stimulate interest in seamanship and navigation. So then, if you're doing the routing from on board, what are the tools you can use on board to do routing? And the options for that include, Expedition, Adrena, and for anyone who wants to be a professional navigator, they're going to want to use one or both of those two. And then there's other options that are cheaper, OpenCPM, Time Zero, and I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, QTVLM. And then those tools that you use to compute routes, one of the benefits for the crew of doing that route calculation on board is you get a much more insightful ability to make your own decisions by looking at the reverse and forward isochrons, by seeing how important the course is, seeing what regions of the course you have flexibility to go to one side or the other, for cheaply, and you have the ability to compute the free advance course, which is, which way would you move the boat if you could move the boat 10 miles in any direction. And that's a very helpful thing for the crew to always know when you're, so that if you get a squall, the crew knows exactly where to go to take advantage of that squall. And those are the kinds of things that are benefits to doing the routing on board, that you have the tools that can allow you to run those kinds of experiments, to analyze the sensitivity of course selection, analyze the free advance course, look at alternatives. And so those are additional benefits of doing onboard routing, in addition to the benefit that it's legal. Let's go to the next slide, and then I think we'll get back to this. Don't cheat even inadvertently. And this is nowadays with people having, Starlink on their boats. And so in some cases, boats have internet access all the time, during the race, because boats will just leave Starlink, connected. And in some cases, boats will make the Starlink access point, available to the crew members, through their phones, etc. So there's a real risk with social media of inadvertent cheating. And we've seen this in some of the other races. But in social media, people can send the boat a message saying, "Oh, I suspect you're going to jibe in 2 hours." Well, in some respects, that boat just cheated. So be very careful of the pitfalls of social media. Warn the crew not to engage in discussions about the course, and certainly not to get advice about the course. And then remember that Predict Wind is fine, and it's a great source of weather data, and it's an easy place to download grid files, but don't use Predict Wind routing. And don't hire, consultants to give you routing from shore. That's forbidden according to the current Transpac rules. So in the case of Predict Wind, you will need to uncheck the routing box if you have the pro subscription that gives you the access to do those kinds of downloads. Alan, you want to pitch in on that?
I think you pretty well said it, Stan, on that, is that you can get the weather, you can get position or information, AIS information from online, but you cannot get outside advice on where to go and that sort of thing. The only way you can get outside advice is there is something in the sailing instructions that if your boat is having a physical problem and you need to contact the designer, the builder, or something like that to solve an emergency issue, read the sailing instructions or read the notice of race on that, and it tells you exactly what has to be done there, including the reporting requirements to the race committee. But otherwise, that we're supposed to be out there racing on the race course, and with the people that are on the boat, on our team on the boat, and that's how we follow the rules. So that's basically some of the new things that we have here in Transpac. We have the FTCF scoring, which should be an improvement when Transpac is allowing the paid weather information and paid AIS type position information. And all boats are required to have their AIS transmitting throughout the race, just like you're required to use your running lights at night. So that's what we have here as our formal presentation. And we'll be able to open things up for a few minutes for questions here. I think, Randy, do we have any questions?
Yeah, well, I've had some good ones come in along the way. I've been answering a few of them, the ones that I had answers to. But since we were just on Predict Wind, we've had a couple on that. So why is Predict Wind routing illegal? It's a tool just as Expedition.
I mean, I'll take a cut at that, but it's really a cultural decision by the Transpac board, and I'm not on the Transpac board, although I, agree with the board in this case. I think to answer it in a very broad way, I guess as sailors, we need to ask ourselves, on what basis do we want to compete in the future? And the future that I dread is the future that I've seen when I've done shore navigation for French teams, like the Ultime 100-foot foiling trimarans, that you've got, the sailors on the boat, and then you have, a 10-person team on shore that's telling them where to go and when to tack and when to jibe and when to use the Jenniker 4 inches, and the autopilot steering the boat. And so then you find yourself in a future for the sport where the folks on the boat are just competing basically on the mechanics, the sail changes and the tacks and the jibes, and all the decisions are being made from shore. And I think what we want to do is we want to decide as sailors and as a community on what basis do we want to compete in the future. And in the past, we have competed based on steering and trimming and tactics and navigation and strategy and boat preparation and all those things. And in the future, do we really want a situation where there's a a smart intelligence on shore, and it knows where every boat is, and it knows it has access to all the best weather model, and it tells every boat in the race where to go. I mean, is that how we want future Transpacs to feel, where this intelligence on shore has all the best information about the weather and where every boat is, and then basically tells every boat where to go. And the current answer to that from most events around the world is no, we want to try to find a way to continue to compete the way we have in the past, where the sailors are doing the trimming and the steering and the tactics and the navigation. But it's a really good question. And it's possible to ask that question in a very difficult way, as Volker did, which is, what's the difference whether a program runs in a computer on shore or whether a program runs, in a computer on the boat. But in some ways, there is a difference, because the boat and the crew of that boat, with the tools that they have, are competing. And I suspect these rules will continue to change. And I think we as a group are going to have to think through what we want the future of our sport to be like, and on what basis do we want to compete in the future. But it's a really, really good question.
I think along the lines of what Stan's saying, it's not just about predict wind, which is software as a service or whatever, as opposed to something that resides in your computer. It's how do you allow predict wind without allowing Stan and his team of 10 guys ashore to be routing a boat. And so the way things are right now, if you say you allow that sort of work to be done off the boat, you basically allow somebody to have their full shore team that's 24-hour navigator working in 8-hour shifts or whatever, 3 navigators working in 8-hour shifts. So they've got somebody there all the time ashore. And that's not what most people think of a Transpac race. One of the things people look at is promoting seamanship, promoting self-sufficiency, and things like that. So that's what things are at the present time.
Hey, Alan, I think, Volker, we've never met, but yeah, as Stan said, great question. And from my race official background, this tonight is wonderful. And I think I will speak to, Alan and I will speak to the jury and the race committee. And I kind of look at this just like a match race regatta. And a lot of times we'll have to make a call. There's a question about some match race move, and we'll have to make an event call so everybody's all on the same page. And I think this predict win thing is going to be a big one that we need to make an event call on, so that it's very clear. So I think, thank you for bringing this up, and I'm hopeful that we can put something else out that clarifies predict win a little better. So good answer. Another question, so this is from John Raymond and Eric Schlegler. So it looks like the higher performance planing boats have a larger delta under the FTCF under the 2023 scenario. Could you explain?
Yes. The biggest reason for that is the higher performance planing boats in the last start day, that was the graph on the left, those boats had the weather that differed from, they had the worst weather of the 3 different start days. So they were rated as though they had a lot more wind than what they had in the first third or first half of the race. So their corrected time performance was poor because the wind matrix expected they were going a lot faster, particularly in the first third of the race.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we had a similar question from John Raymond. I think that's probably same question, same answer, John. If it's not, please ping in if you need further clarification. So I think we've covered that one. And just, yeah, I answered a few questions. Everybody wants to know when the class breaks are coming out. I said in the next few days. Alan, am I correct on that?
Yes, the class breaks will be out basically as soon as we can get them posted.
Okay. And yeah, and I think the other thing, and we'll talk about this at the competitors briefing, but I think everybody is wanting to know what time of day on their start day they will be able to access their final rating
I
numbers. And
thought that was in the sailing instructions, but I believe the ratings will be people have them by 11 o'clock.
yeah, that sounds familiar.
We are trying to get the most accurate rating available, and that has to do, some of that has to do with the GFS forecast is published 4 times a day. And so
Yeah.
we want to use the most accurate GFS forecast available. And then HRRR forecast is published hourly. And we're really lucky that the calculations are being done on the East Coast, so they're awake and working 3 hours earlier than we are.
Yeah.
And just for reference, they did the same calculations for the Bermuda race last year, and I believe they had around 120 boats, and they all started on one start day, and they got all the ratings done easily on that one morning. And we have about 20 boats starting a day, so there shouldn't be a calculation issue on doing that. And there are also other plans afoot to be doing a dry run the night before, so that something's in the can in case Noah's got a problem or something like that.
Yeah, it has helped to have a computer with multiple processing cores, but it runs like the wind now. So that's been a big help.
So that's all we got in Q&A land that I can find. That I think we've answered everything else. So well, just, yeah, this is a question from Roy Disney, which I answered. So if there is an AIS, problem, or a running light problem for that matter, both of those are rules. They have to be on, and if they're not on, it's a breach of a rule. A competitor can protest, the race committee can protest, and you just follow the racing rules of sailing. And we are running under the US SCR offshore equipment rules, and those require a boat to have the AIS, and then the racing rules of sailing require you to have it on if you're required to have it. So that kind of completes the chain on that. So I think that's all we got.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. Thank you for joining us. And we'll see many of you at the skipper's meeting or person in charge meeting. And we'll see the rest of you at the Aloha send-off and then on the starting line. So aloha and mahalo.
Aloha. Thanks, Stan, for doing this. Much appreciated.
Yes.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you,
Okay,
Stan.
take care.
Thanks, Randy.
Thanks,
Alan.
Randy. And Allie in the background.